name is Dwayne Haggerty, and I'm President and CEO of Heritage Works, and welcome to our first installment of our virtual Architect in 2021. Today we are here at St. Matthias and Cascade. We're also going to be touring St. Clement in Bankston as well. And for those of you that are familiar with Architect, Architect is a partnership between Heritage Works and Dubuque Museum of Art. And we feel that the best way to experience our cultural assets are to get out on foot to experience the beautiful architecture and the art that we have in our community. And so we're taking this opportunity to get outside of Dubuque to look at these two beautiful church structures. And this gives us an opportunity to talk not only about the architecture of these buildings, but also to talk about some of the history of Gothic Revival architecture, and also to talk about some of the history of architect Guido Beck, who was the architect for both this building, St. Matthias and Cascade, which was originally known as St. Martin's, and then St. Clement and Bankston. Before we start out on our tour, we'll give you a little bit of background about Gothic Revival architecture. For those of you who are interested in history, you know that much of history is a series of actions and reactions and pushes and pulls. Medieval Gothic architecture itself was a revolution in the 12th century in France and then spread to the rest of Europe. In the time period leading up to the Gothic period, churches had thick stone walls with small windows. Church interiors were dark and closed in. Several innovations led to the Gothic style. First, the innovation of the pointed arch would support much more weight, allowing for larger windows and higher walls. A series of groined pointed arch vaults also supported much more weight and allowed for higher walls and ceilings. Also, the use of buttresses could support the lateral stresses of higher walls. These innovations resulted in some of the greatest buildings and monuments built by human beings. But as time went on and history moved into the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods, Gothic architecture, rightly or wrongly, became associated with repressive and backwards religious and social thought. In modern lexicon, the word Gothic is now associated with medievalism and the Dark Ages, which is unfortunate because Gothic architecture brought light, openness, and grandeur to religious spaces in the Middle Ages. Greek and Roman classicism was the preferred architectural style of the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods. With the perceived backwardness of medieval times, people looked to the Greek and Romans as examples of great thought, great art, and great architecture. Throughout Europe, architecture from the 1500s to the early 1800s emulated the classical temples and structures of ancient Rome and Greece. With the dawn of the 19th century and the age of the Industrial Revolution, people again began to see that technology and progress had its winners and losers. The Industrial Revolution brought millions out of the countryside and into crowded cities, causing squalor, disease, and social dysfunction. People began to look to the past again for an escape from the excesses of the period. This led to the rise of the Gothic Revival architecture in the late 1700s and into the late 1800s. The most famous proponent of Gothic Revival architecture in England was Augustus Pugin, who designed numerous churches in England from the 1840s to the 1860s. He also designed secular buildings such as the Houses of Parliament at Westminster, including the interior of the House of Lords, a beautiful Gothic Revival interior. Augustus Pugin believed that the only appropriate architecture for a church was Gothic architecture. So the St. Matthias, the parish, originally St. Martin's, was started in 1853. And it was the parish for the local Irish population in Cascade. Cascade had two predominant ethnic groups. One was the Irish and the other was German. And the Germans had their own parish just a couple blocks away at St. Mary's. St. Martin's, they built a stone church in the 1860s, and in 1889 they added a very large 130-foot tall Gothic tower onto the front facade of their building. But then 10 years later, they realized that that building was too small for their congregation. So they decided that they needed to expand their church. Having just built a new Gothic tower, they decided that they would keep that tower but demolish the rest of the building. And so they reached out to several architects to give them proposals for the design of this church. And one of the requirements was that the design had to incorporate the existing Gothic tower. And so there were two, from what we know, there were two architects that submitted proposals. One was George Stadahauer, who was an architect based out of Rock Island, Illinois. He was a very prolific Catholic church designer. He provided a design for this building, and it was a Gothic design, but it included only one tower, the existing tower, on the left-hand side of the building. But the footprint was very similar to what we're seeing here today. But the parish decided to engage Guido Beck as the architect for this building. Guido Beck was a Dubuque architect who specialized in the architecture of churches and schools. Beck was born in Hohenzollern, Germany, where he received his early education and later studied architecture at Stuttgart and the University of Heidelberg. In 1882, against the wishes and advice of all of his friends, Beck left his native country and emigrated to the United States. He thought his chances for success were infinitely greater and the field of work much broader in the United States, because as we all know, there was a large influx of German immigrants to the United States during that period. Upon his arrival to the United States, Beck first settled in Rock Island, Illinois, and worked as a stonecutter in the government arsenal there. He familiarized himself with the English language and the American customs, thoroughly mastering the American style of architecture. With the knowledge he already possessed, Beck quickly became one of the foremost architects in the state of Iowa. In 1885, he came to Dubuque and partnered first with fellow German architect Fridolin Herr. After a few years, he left that partnership to develop his own practice. With the booming Catholic population in Dubuque and the surrounding area, Beck specialized in church architecture. He designed over 100 church buildings throughout the region, one as far away as Bozeman, Montana. Although he designed many churches in the Gothic Revival style, there are also other styles that he worked in, including the Romanesque Revival style. In addition to St. Matthias and Cascade and St Clement and Bankston, other notable churches in the area that Beck designed: St. Anthony Church in Dubuque, St. Columbkille's Church in Dubuque, Holy Ghost Church, and St. Joseph Chapel at Loras College. And the interesting thing about Guido Beck's designs is that there were drawings that were shown in the newspaper at the time, and one of the articles showed the front facade of the building, the south facade. It showed the existing tower. One of the drawings just showed one tower, but then another drawing showed that there were twin towers on each side of the facade of the building. And of course, only the existing tower was actually included in the design, and for whatever reason, the other tower was not constructed. Before we get into the interior of St. Matthias Church, let's talk a little bit about what makes this a Gothic Revival design. So from the exterior, when we look at it, the first thing that sticks out is that this is a church that was constructed with limestone block. Gothic Revival architects preferred stone as a building material because it conveyed a sense of permanence, and then it also harkened back to the great Gothic cathedrals of the Middle Ages. The limestone from St. Matthias Church came from quarries near Farley, and one of the interesting things about this limestone is when you look at it up close, there are a bunch of what I would call inclusions that appear to be harder stone that is kind of embedded in the softer limestone. Another element that makes St. Matthias stand out as a Gothic Revival church is the numerous pointed arch windows and doors that are in all of the facades of the church. The steeple is always an important element of a Gothic Revival church. Gothic Revival churches have many different configurations of where the steeple will be located. The steeple can be located kind of offset to the side, as it is here in with St. Martin's Church. You can have two steeples on a Gothic Revival church. You can have the steeple in the center of the church, which we will see, and in Bankston. The tower and steeple is always an architectural marvel of the Gothic Revival design. The St. Matthias steeple has a square base with a octagonal top, and the bell is located about halfway up the height of the steeple. The base of the steeple is constructed with stone, but then the bell structure is a timber structure that resembles, in some cases, an oil derrick on the interior of the tower. St. Matthias has a unique spiral staircase that leads from the main floor to the choir loft and then leads up to the tower. The spiral staircase is expressed on the exterior by the rounded turret on the southeast corner of the church. The bell on the tower automatically rings every hour, as we were so fortunate to experience when we were inside the tower at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Some other interesting Gothic Revival elements of the St. Martin's design that we'll talk about more on the interior is that it has a transept, which is a crossing aisle towards the front of the church, and then it also has a chancel, which is also called the sanctuary, which is rectangular in plan, which is unique to this type of church. Okay. So as we enter the church, the first space that we see is an area called the narthex. And this is also known as a vestibule, but in Gothic terms, narthex is the kind of the entry area where you enter the space. And one of the purposes of this would have been to separate kind of the outside from the interior sanctuary. So be it an airlock, it would also be kind of a sound barrier so that you wouldn't have the street noise from, that you would hear from the interior. So then as we enter the space, here you have kind of the typical, with a Gothic Revival church, you would have a long nave, which is the aisle that heads up to the altar. In St. Matthias, you have this really wide open space. In most Gothic Revival churches, you would have a nave, and then you would have two side aisles. And when we go to Bankston, you will see that plan. But here in Cascade, you don't have that, which is really kind of a unique feature of a Gothic Revival church, having kind of this open span, which really kind of opens up the space. Let's take a quick look behind the scenes to see how that wide open space was constructed. The wide open span of the church interior is possible only because of massive timber trusses that are in the attic of the church. The attic extends about 15 to 20 feet above the ridge of the church sanctuary. The plaster ceiling is suspended on these wood trusses, which gives you the volume of space that you have in the church. As we're walking down the nave, we come to an area that's known as a transept. In a lot of Gothic Revival churches, the plan is what is known as a Latin cross, kind of your typical cross that has a long staff and then the arms. And so here we're at kind of the arms of the cross. And again, this is called a transept. And a lot of Gothic Revival churches would have this. This one is kind of what I would call an abbreviated transept. A lot of transepts would have additional seating on either side to give additional space to the church. But in this case, as you come down here, you see that they have, on the one side is a statue of the Pietà, and then on the other side, they have kind of an ensemble of the crucifix with various kind of devotional candles. And so this is where they're putting their statues and their devotional altars. As we look to the front of the church, that area is what's called the chancel, or a lot of people refer to it as a sanctuary. And this one is also unique because the chancel is in a kind of a rectangular plan. And that's not uncommon when it comes to like an English Gothic revival structure. The chancel is typically rectangular, but we don't see that a lot in this part of the country. What we will see when we go to Bankston is that the chancel or sanctuary is in a kind of an octagonal form, more of a rounded apse type of form. But this one is rectangular, and it has two kind of what I call cathedral glass windows on either side. And cathedral glass is the type of glass that doesn't really have much by way of figures. It's just stained glass that's opaque, that lets in some nice light into the area. And I'm guessing in these windows in this chancel don't have figures, mostly because of you wouldn't really be able to see those from where you're seated unless you were up in the sanctuary. The sanctuary also has this beautiful altar, beautiful reredos, made all of wood, and that is original to the building. These altars were almost kind of Gothic structures in and of themselves. You see there's a lot of detail in that altar. And that was beautifully redone as part of the renovation that was done several years ago. Okay. Several years ago, the parish embarked on a complete renovation of the church building, both exterior and interior. And they did an excellent job on the renovation. Some of the things that they did on the interior is they were able to uncover some of the original stencils. They did back in, I believe, 2013, 2014. They had someone come in and kind of remove layers of paint so that they could see what the original stencil design was. So based on that information, they had the painter redo the stencil. The painting company is the Kaiser company based out of Dubuque, Iowa. And so Kaiser did all of the interior painting. You can see, the stencils above the wainscoting, but then also stencils along the windows, and then up into the vaulting. You can see also that what looks like wood, and it is wood up on the ceiling. That's actually faux grain to look like grained wood, and that was done as part of the interior restoration. The other thing that they did, which again is amazing, is that of course we know that in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, a lot of these kind of traditional, beautiful churches, they were modernized, and a lot of materials were removed that were considered to be, kind of out of date or too traditional. And so at that time period, these two the original side altars were removed, and then the main altar was modified quite substantially. But based on the historic photos, they were able to replicate the original side altars, and they had those replicated by the Gunder Furniture Company here in Iowa. And so they were pretty faithfully replicated, and the main altar had some additions to it as well. They also had the flooring. There was red carpet all over the church, and they changed the red carpet out, and they had the altar area had new hardwood floors, and then underneath the pews also has hardwood. At the same time, they also restored all of the windows. Boulevard Studios out of Fairfield, Iowa, restored all the windows. Some of them were removed completely and taken to the studio and redone. The rest of them were restored in place. So again, just some great restoration work that was done in this church. One of the things about Cascade, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, is that originally there were two parishes here in Cascade, one for the German congregation, St. Mary's a couple blocks away, and then St. Martin's, now St. Matthias, was the Irish congregation. And a lot of communities, when they're combining parishes, kind of to split the baby, they just decide, okay, we're going to close these historic churches, and then we're going to build a new building to kind of give everyone a new building and get started fresh. Well, this community didn't do that, and much to their credit, they saved both of their historic churches, so both of them are still in existence, and this building in particular is still in use, and a lovely church. Okay. Here at St. Matthias, there are some beautiful stained glass windows that would have been installed in 1899 when the church was constructed, and we don't really know much about the fabricator of the windows. Most likely it was a window company based out of Chicago. A lot of the churches in this area got their windows from Chicago. Lots of times they were ordered from a catalog, with some specifications of what sort of figures they wanted in the windows. But here in the transept, we have two, as I mentioned, the Gothic revival kind of features, the pointed arch windows. So we have two of those pointed arch windows here, and then above it, we have these beautiful kind of rose windows. And a rose window is a round window with petals that look like a flower or a rose. And there's lots of kind of symbology related to that rose window. There's in a lot of cases it just determines how many petals there are, but if like a 12 petal window would signify the 12 apostles. In this case there are 6 petals, so I'm not sure what that symbology would be, but the rose window has it also has a lot of connection with the Virgin Mary as a rose. And so throughout the rest of the church, going down the aisle, you have figures. One window has St. Patrick, which of course was the patron saint of the Irish, and just other saints that would have been important to the Catholic faith at the time. So again, these were all restored in about 10 years ago, and they're just a beautiful feature of this space. This space is currently used as the sacristy for the church, but in the original plans, this was designated as the winter chapel for the church. So this would have been where in the wintertime for probably weekday services that they would have used this space for masses, because in that case then they wouldn't have had to bring the whole church up to the heat to be able to have services there. More than likely they would have had services there on the weekend, but a lot of churches of this time period had separate spaces in their church buildings for the winter chapel. When we go to Bankston, they actually have their winter chapel in the basement. So here we are at the spiral staircase going up into the choir loft, and this is a really great feature of the architecture of this building, and it's actually expressed on the exterior as well. I think we showed you on the exterior this kind of turret that goes up that side of the building, and that's where this spiral staircase is. And the spiral staircase leads to the choir loft, and then from the choir loft up to the bell tower. And the choir loft itself was not only for the choir, but then there was also additional seating in the choir loft. The newspaper articles talking about the design of the building mentioned that up to 100 people could be seated in the choir loft. We're now in the choir loft, and again, this would have been where the choir would have been located during the Mass, and also, of course, the pipe organ is here. But the pipe organ actually comes from the former St. Mary's Church here in Cascade, which is just a couple blocks north. So when that parish closed, when that church was no longer used as services, they moved this organ, this beautiful organ, from that church into this space. And as you can see, it's certainly a historic organ. It still has its historic organ case and all the great pipes. But up here on the choir loft too, you get a great view of the space below, and you get the sense of the openness of the space. One other thing that's interesting too, during the renovation, these choir lofts, when they were constructed, the railings were really, really low, much lower than what would be code, when you build a new building today. So for safety purposes, they have this new kind of iron railing constructed to kind of increase the height of the railing to make sure that no one would inadvertently fall over the side of the choir loft. So for the second leg of our tour, we are now in Bankston in St. Clement's Church, And I have with me today Jack Smith, who's a parishioner here at St. Clement. And Jack will tell us a little bit about the history of Bankston, and then also later on will tell us about some of the restoration work that's gone here at the church.
All right. Well, thanks, Dwayne. Bankston settlement preceded the establishment of the parish by about 15 years. So we're looking at like the 1830s is when the actual settlement started to get established here. And it was known then as Bankston's Prairie or Bankston's Settlement. And that name he was a Colonel Bankston. And in the original survey of the Fort Atkinson Road, the surveyor's notations in 1841 stated that there was, when he got to this point in his notes, that he came upon a prairie. So I think everything like east of here was typically wooded, and then west was open and was predominantly prairie. So the plot of land that the church sits on was donated by a man named Maurice Kirby. And prior to that first church was built in around 1860. And prior to that, you had a lot of like pioneer priests who traveled on horseback and then basically said mass in people's homes. And then in 1860, they built the first church here and established the cemetery. And ironically, Maurice Kirby was one of the first people to be buried in the cemetery here, maybe the first. In 1860, he died shortly after donating the land for the church. And then Father William Banfield was the pastor here when the present church was built. And he was pastor, I believe, about 1893 to about 1953, so about 60 years. And then he started the drive to build the present church, relatively soon after he came here. And his goal, I've read some articles about him, and his goal was to have a parish that became the center of community life in Bankston. And by all accounts, he succeeded at his goal because in a rural area like this, church became important as far as community life. And to a large degree, it's still that way here. Our community is focused around the parish and the church to a large degree. So that's
okay,
kind of what I have, I guess.
Great. So as Jack mentioned, Father Banfield made plans to build a new building and started raising money for it. And so then the parish hired architect Guido Beck to design a Gothic revival church. And the cornerstone was laid in 1898, and between 1898 and 1899, this building was constructed. And the building was dedicated in dedication mass on October 25th, 1899, and the dedication was attended by over 1,000 people. And there's a newspaper article in the Dubuque Daily Times that has a really good description of the building at the time, describing a lot of where the materials came from and where the furnishings and things like that came from. So it was really a beautiful building that was supported by the parish, and the parish did an excellent job of purchasing the materials for it at the time. The building was projected to cost about $25,000. Guido Beck indicated in that newspaper article that it was about $25,000 to construct the church. The stone for the basement, the limestone, came from the Bankston quarry, and then the stone above the ground came from the Farley quarry, and which is an indication that the Bankston stone was probably a little bit too soft to have a use above ground, but that the Farley stone was much higher quality that was then used for the walls above the ground. It also talked about the windows that you can see around you came from Kinsella and Company, which was a Chicago stained glass company. Windows of the period were typically in a church like this would have been ordered out of the catalog. In a place like Chicago, that could have easily been shipped here by train. The altars came from the Dubuque Altar and Manufacturing Company. Dubuque was a center of church furnishings. They had several companies that manufactured altars and pews and other furnishings used in churches. And the painting, none of which is here currently, but the painting and stenciling was done by the Brillmeyer firm out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which did a lot of the painting and decorating of churches in the surrounding area. So 1899 was when the church came into being. And when we talk about Gothic revival architecture, a lot of the hallmarks of Gothic revival architecture you see in this building. On the outside, it's a brick structure, so typically you would have wanted a stone structure for a Gothic revival structure, but brick was a pretty common material here in this part of the country, so brick was used for this, and there was some indication that some of the bricks at least were manufactured on the site. Potentially the soft bricks were manufactured here, and the hard face bricks were manufactured somewhere else. It has the center tower plan, so the tower is in the center of the front facade, whereas when we were in Cascade, the tower was over on the side. And it has all the pointed arched openings that that you would see in a Gothic revival structure. This building also is unique because it is a good example of a specific style of Gothic architecture, which is either called High Victorian or Ruskinian architecture. And the Ruskinian architecture was named after John Ruskin, who was an architect and designer during the Gothic revival period. And it is kind of characterized by some polychrome, both the use of both brick and stone. And when you look on the exterior of this church, it has, especially at the arches, the pointed arches, you have kind of an alternating brick and stone that gives you kind of a variation of coloring on the exterior. And some of the buildings that are known for that, most of them are in London. One of them is the St Pancras train station in London. And you'll see, when you look at that, you kind of see a lot of the elements in that you see here in the Bankston church. So, these architects knew of these types of styles of architecture, and so here you could see Guido Beck was taking some of the references that he had seen in other locations and bringing them to the countryside. The thing that is iconic here in the Bankston church is this pointed arch groin vaulting. And you have the traditional nave, which is the center aisle, which goes from the front door to the altar, and then flanking that nave you have the two aisles. The nave has the height of the ceilings are 45 feet, and on the side aisles the height is 36 feet. So you have a lower ceiling on the side aisles, and it's that kind of groin vaulting that is an element of Gothic revival architecture, and it's also an element that during the medieval Gothic period allowed these buildings to have the height and the ability to have these large open windows and thinner walls, so that you could have more open natural light coming into a space. Here, the groin vaulting is not structural. It's made out of plaster. There is no need to have the groin vaulting to support the structure of the church. It's the wood trusses above that support the structure. But it's kind of the element of Gothic architecture that you want to see in a Gothic revival church. The other thing about these churches too is there was, with Gothic revival, there was a modification in German churches. They were called hall churches, and Germany had this tradition of having, preaching was very important even to German Catholics, and so you wanted this large open space where the voices would carry. And so a Gothic church typically has this kind of very high nave with clerestory windows, and so that's harder for the voices to carry because there's such a large volume above. But in German hall churches, you don't have that clerestory, which here we don't have. And then you also, your side aisles are not that much lower than the main aisle. So that's one of the characteristics. Guido Beck, being a German, would have known about that. They were called Hallenkirche, which is hall church in German. And so you see that element of this here in the Bankston church. There's really only a few Gothic revival churches in the area that are kind of traditional Gothic with that high clerestory window, and that would be New Vienna has the clerestory windows, and then there's a church in Dubuque, St. John's Episcopal Church, that has clerestory windows as well. I think that the other thing, these beautiful altars, very much a Gothic element. The altars themselves are Gothic structures, and there's a lot of elements on these altars that are kind of traditional Gothic applications. You have all of these spires, and they have the little pieces that are kind of on the edges are called crockets, and then you have these pinnacles that are up at the top, and all these flourishes, and then there's quatrefoils. Quatrefoils are there's no quatrefoils in here. On that window, where you have the three lobes, that's called a trefoil or a trefoil, which is a tri-lobe figure, and that was to symbolize the Holy Trinity. So here in the church, there are a lot of really interesting interior elements, and the column capitals are plaster, and they are what are called Corinthian capitals. The Corinthian capitals are the capitals that are more kind of floral. They're acanthus leaves and more. So that's a classical order of Corinthian columns. So you'll see those at the top of the columns. You'll see those at the top of those little colonnettes. You'll also see them over on the side with those, kind of the springing arches. You have those flourishing Corinthian kind of bases for that. The other thing is, this is a beautiful choir loft. This is wood. It's been painted, but you do see. I was mentioning the quatrefoils before. You do have the quatrefoils, are those four-lobed geometric figures there. And one of the things that the article mentioned, that all of the wood here, the wood finished pieces, were supplied by the Carrider and Adams Company in Dubuque, which is Caradco Company, which was a large millworking and finished wood company in Dubuque. And again, the cast iron columns that are supporting the choir loft also have that kind of Corinthian column capital. So just a lot of great finished details here in this church. St. Clement's has some beautiful stained glass windows as well. The windows are relatively simple in the terms of their composition. They have portrayals of saints. Here behind me is St. Patrick, which was, of course, the patron saint of the Irish people. And then on the west side, directly across from St. Patrick, is, I believe, St. Boniface, who St. Boniface would have been the patron saint of Germans. And that's one of the interesting things about this parish. Originally, when this area was settled, it was mostly Irish immigrants, but then over time, German immigrants also settled in this area. So when we were in Cascade, you heard us talking about that Cascade had two separate parishes, one for Germans and one for Irish. But here in the country, there wasn't enough of either to have a parish of their own. So this is a parish where they kind of combined together, which was interesting. The article that mentioned the dedication said that the sermon for that ceremony had two separate sermons, one in English for the Irish settlers and German for the Germans. So so I think it kept that kind of mixed character for a long time period. Some of the other windows, again, you have windows of St Clement is portrayed in one of the windows, and then various other on the windows in the chancel or sanctuary are windows of the four evangelists, which makes sense because that was typical in a sanctuary or chancel that you would have portrayals of the four evangelists, because this is where the gospel would have been read and the kind of the central part of the mass celebrated. So you have the four evangelists. These windows, as Jack said, were restored a couple years ago, and they also, as part of that restoration process, they included new storm windows, which will protect these windows both, from being broken but also from the elements. It'll protect the wood frames for years to come.
Yep.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So we're here in the lower level of the tower. We're actually just right above the front door when you walk in, and here's a good spot for you to see kind of how these buildings were constructed. Here, the brick masonry walls were literally several feet thick. Here, we believe that this particular wall is 8 wythes thick, W-Y-T-H-E, I believe, and a wythe is basically the width of a brick. And so they would lay these bricks out, but then they would tie them together so that it created a strong wall. And in a tower like this, it's 16 and a half feet square. You would have had the thicker walls down low because it had to support the weight of everything above it. But then as you would go up, the walls would get thinner. And this tower actually converts from a square to an octagon several stories up. So that was the design of the tower, to start kind of low as a square, and then as you got up to the bell level, it changed to an octagon. Okay. We're here in the basement of St. Clement's Church, and it's in an area that it was indicated that there was a winter chapel in the basement of this church. And we're not entirely sure whether this was actually ever used as a winter chapel, but you can see where it could have been, or the plan, it would have potentially been a space where you could have had usable space for services. You see, there's decorative items here. The column capitals, again with that Corinthian capital. This is cast iron. So cast iron column, cast iron Corinthian capital. And cast iron, is very strong and has really high compressive strength, so it would have held, these massive beams. But also you can see the remnants that there would have been full height windows here, that there would have been window wells, but that would have brought natural light into this space, which would have, of course, been necessary in 1899 because electricity wasn't common in buildings like this. So this is a really interesting space. It's a dirt floor. There's no indication that there was any floor here, but it could have potentially been at one time a finished floor with wood or some sort of finished material. So anyway, just another interesting aspect of these old churches is how they tried to utilize as much space as they could.
So the present restoration of the paint and the decoration was done in 93 through 94, 1993, 1994. And then I think about 10 to 12 years ago, we did quite a bit of work on the tower, tuck pointing, painting, fixing up the louvers a little bit, and making the tower bird proof. And then that preceded Father Schuler's arrival here. And then when Father became pastor, he kind of did a a study of the needs of every campus, and he determined that our windows definitely needed attention. And prior to his arrival here, we would try to kind of piecemeal them, fix up the worst ones, and so they really weren't done in a uniform way. They kind of looked odd. Some of them were fixed some ways, and then others in other manners. And so Father decided that we needed to try to start a capital campaign to do the whole collection. And in retrospect, that was really the right thing to do, because you can see as you look around, they're obviously really beautiful. And then also Father took it upon himself to get some work done on our bell, and the actual mechanism where the bell swung was getting kind of bad, and so that was taken care of, and now the bell rings automatically as it just did. And then the other project we have done over this past year is a new roof on the church. The previous one, I think, was 30 some years old and served us really well, but we were starting to get a little water damage with the gutters. So the gutters have been soldered and repaired, and then we have a new standing seam metal roof that was completed just this past summer. So, and then the only other thing we've done to the area around the church is we've replaced a bunch of concrete, the parking lot and sidewalks and things like that. So that pretty much sums up the work we've done recently.
This concludes our tour for the day of St. Matthias and Cascade and St. Clement in Bankston. I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our next virtual architrect. Thank you.